Hi, folks. Ryan Honeyman here from Lyft Economy. Many folks have come to us over the last 10 years and asked, how do I get more involved in creating an economy that works for the benefit of all life? They also ask, what skills and experiences do I need to help make this transition? So 3 years ago, we created something called the Next Economy Mba to help address this and similar questions. Lyft Economy's Next Economy Mba is an online course that's designed for entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, students, recent graduates, employees, and folks who want to learn more about transformational next economy strategies and businesses. Join the growing alumni network of nearly 250 alumni who've gone through this program and learned essential skills and hopefully built lifelong relationships for catalyzing businesses in the emergent and regenerative economy. So we encourage you to check out our course. You can go to lifteconomy.com/MBA. The next course, Cohort 7, starts on September 21st, 2021. So once again, go to www.lifteconomy.com/MBA. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Jessie, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So Jessie, let's start with perhaps a basic question. What is resource generation?
Resource generation is a national network community organizing organization in the United States. We have chapters in 16 cities around the country, and we work with young people between the ages of 18 and 35 who have wealth and class privilege, so either grew up with wealth and class privilege or are making significant amounts of wealth in their early life, and folks who are left of center, who believe that the current system and the current vast division of wealth in the US and certainly in the world is unjust and unequitable, and together we're all working for a world in which there is an equitable distribution of land, wealth, and power.
Phenomenal. And how did you first hear about resource generation? How did you get involved?
Sure. I got involved from a very personal place. I was a college student studying various issues of justice and starting to get involved in some campus organizing. And I knew that I was going to be graduating from an elite private university without student loans. And many of my friends had loans. I was going to be graduating and set to inherit a bit of a trust fund from my grandparents. And I knew that my situation was not the situation of most people around me, even at that school, let alone most people in the country and the world. And I really was grappling with what my role was in movements for progressive change and progressive justice, knowing that mostly I was not directly impacted by any of the oppression and any of the injustice I was seeing in the world. And I happened upon resource generation through, early 2000s version of a blog. And I found the story of someone who was then actively involved in resource generation and was just struck with, oh my gosh, there are people who, rather than avoiding their privilege, are going straight towards it and actually using it and leveraging it and speaking out from a place of it to make change. So it was a very empowering find, I think, for me to really go, aha, like I can organize my own people and my own community. And actually, it's important for me to be a leader in that regard, which is, I think, for me, was a very fulfilling and reassuring role to find.
So you were using the weblogs back in the day.
Yes, exactly. It was a live journal or something, which
Nice.
I don't believe exists anymore. Yeah.
And what's the history of resource generation? What was sort of the impetus to start it originally?
Mm-hmm. Resource generation was actually founded by or conceived of by a cross-class and multiracial group of people in the Boston area in the mid-1990s. And the idea originated from actually a gathering that the Haymarket People's Fund, which is a social justice foundation in Boston, would organize annually a meeting of donors and funders of social justice work, of grassroots organizing. And there were a lot of young people in this space who didn't quite see themselves reflected in those conferences or their needs being met, because they were coming in and saying, we aren't just donors. We aren't just trying to be completely hands off from the work. We are actually, in community with the organizations that we fund. So we're wearing multiple different hats, if you will. We are major donors and funders of some of this very key and crucial community organizing, but we're also people who volunteer there. We're neighbors of the people who are impacted by the work. We are friends, we are colleagues. And so how do we really bring our full selves as people who are wealthy, people who have class privilege, people who are big donors? How do we bring our full selves to the work that we're supporting? And sort of integrate our various roles rather than keeping them so separate, which is sort of the pattern of many more traditional donor spaces, right? It's like you take, you have your gala for your donors, and then you have your party for your members, and those are separate. Or you take your donors out to lunch at this place. There's a lot of separation between particularly major or more wealthy donors and the actual communities that many grassroots organizations work in and serve. And so the desire originally for resource generation was to really help young activist donors really figure out how to be most effective in playing those multiple roles.
And I love this idea of going towards rather than running away from, because it's sort of like the system is messed up. We've benefited from that, and we're not just going to then go to the Caribbean and sort of avoid it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so could you speak more about that sort of dichotomy and how it plays out within resource generation?
Sure. I think, there's no one story or one narrative of a person who comes into resource generation or is a member, but I think, a lot of times it's not hard to notice the stark wealth divide in the United States. And I think many people, in resource generation, it's many folks who come in, it's not that they, otherwise would have, been on Rich Kids of Instagram and gone to the Caribbean and totally checked out, although some wealthy young people do choose to do that. But rather it's a desire and it's a need for how to best leverage that position of wealth and privilege in a thoughtful way, because I think, like, the way privilege and oppression operates is that unless you are taking proactive and thoughtful steps towards not replicating the system that's in place, you are just by inertia going to replicate the system that is in place. So I think what resource generation provides that's so valuable is tools and skills and methods of taking action for young people with wealth to do things differently than we would sort of otherwise be passively doing them, in terms of setting up our lives, in terms of taking on the question of, like, how much is enough? How much is enough to save? How much is enough to give away? All of these questions that we're really examining differently.
Just out of curiosity, I think the happiness number has maybe been debunked of, like, you only need 100,000 and everything above that is sort of just more stuff. But, on that question, like, what is enough? I mean, it's probably varies from person to person, but has there been sort of like a general, like, $250,000 or $100,000 a year is enough? What are your thoughts on that?
Great question. We haven't put a number on it. We've tried at various points to do so, especially with the question, how much is enough, is so dependent on an individual's circumstances. For example, we have members who are first generation wealth earners who come from, communities that have been and continue to be impacted by racism and racial injustice. And for a first generation wealth earner who might be the first person in their family to have gone to college, who, for the first time are a person in their family who can, pay off the debts of other people in their family, or, finally buy the house that their parents have been renting or underwater on for generations, the question of how much is enough for, someone who is maybe a person of color, who's impacted by racism in this country, who has finally started to earn money to be able to really support security in their own, immediate family and community. That's a really different number around how much is quote unquote enough than, for someone who is a white person who has inherited, intergenerational wealth and comes from generations of people with class privilege and financial security. the basic questions of sort of safety and security and conditions to thrive as a person and as a community are really different for communities that have different multiple generations of wealth, and in particular are white, than for communities that are communities of color, are building wealth for the first time, are recent immigrants, et cetera.
And could you talk a little bit about, you mentioned racial justice, distribution of wealth. What are some of the initiatives, like once someone comes in, say, as a member of Resource Generation, how do you plug them into different initiatives?
Sure. So we do some fundamental things, a combination of political education, community building, and opportunities for people to take action. And so concretely in our chapters in these 16 cities around the country, which are really powered by our member leaders, we really have a community organizing model where the members in our chapters are supported and trained to then be leaders within Resource Generation and throughout various places, in sort of an effort to proliferate the ability to really be a leader around these issues. So we have ongoing meeting groups in our chapters that are called Praxis Groups, and that's actually a word that comes from the educator and theorist Pablo Freire, which means practice and action. Right, the word praxis is the combination of a practice and an action. And so we have these meeting groups that most of our members go through that are the same group of people that meet approximately once a month for 6 months and go through a shared curriculum, if you will, where they in some meetings, they do more personal story sharing and reflection. So really thinking about their own experiences as young people with wealth and class privilege, how race and gender and the location of where they grew up, et cetera, like impact and influence their experience with class and wealth. Political education around, the racial wealth divide and histories of wealth accumulation, how, for example, slavery played a role in wealth accumulation, or the, colonization and extermination of many indigenous people in the United States historically has played a role in wealth accumulation, and really getting to learn some new versions of history that otherwise I don't think we are taught. And then also there's components of action. There's personal action, like really looking at how much money do you have? What are your assets? What will your assets be someday as young people, right? What is our earning potential in career fields we've chosen? Or what money do we stand to inherit when our parents and other older generations pass? And really getting to then examine for ourselves that question of what is enough, right? And in order to say what is enough, first we have to understand what we have access to, and we have to understand how the financial system works. And I think there's a general interesting trend where the wealthier you are, the more complicated and mysterious finances are or are made to you. So particularly as young people, and also the majority of Resource Generation members are women or transgender, gender nonconforming people, and the combination of being having a gender oppression as well as often age oppression coming from financial advisors who are most often, people in the financial sector. You think of, a middle-aged or older white man with gray hair wearing a suit. There's some barriers towards even being able to have access to or be empowered around knowing our financial situations and then being able to take action around them. So there's some components around financial literacy as well as sort of really how to advocate for yourself and your values and your needs in a financial setting where you might not actually be in control or be entrusted with control. And then the last piece around taking action that is the most exciting to me is around taking collective action. It's great when we can all get our own finances in a row and, figure out, really push ourselves on how much is enough for us to keep, but also from our own finances, really how much we want to give away and, put towards that equitable distribution of wealth. But additionally, we are starting to do this more and more. It's a growing edge for us, but partnering with social justice groups, grassroots groups that are working in communities of color, that are working in poor and low income and working class communities, and really joining together in genuine partnership to help win those fights and to really think about making the systemic change that we want to make, right? We can all, sometimes I wonder if like everyone who is progressive and wealthy gave away their money tomorrow, would that be a game changer enough to then actually, be supporting movements enough to advocate to change the system? Or do we really, I think it's a both and, but I think we really need to be working and advocating for systems change, whether it be around taxes or zoning or legislative matters, around access to schooling, around housing and gentrification, around good labor practices. and how, the economy can value and uplift labor and actually pay a living wage to everyone, actually throwing our voices in the mix and leveraging our unique role as people with wealth in those fights, I think is going to create actual change within the systems so that so much wealth is never accumulated in the hands of so few people sort of in the first place.
Yeah. It's really interesting, especially this part about social justice. And I love in one of your core values, it's social justice movements need to be led by communities most directly impacted by injustice. One of my questions is around how do you reconcile the sort of the sort of worst case of this was probably like the Coney 2012, like if you remember the white savior complex, where it's like the white guy from San Diego is like, I'm going to go to Africa and like save these people from this dictator, and it kind of fell apart very publicly, and there was a lot of conversation around sort of white people coming into a different community and saying like, we're going to help fix for you people. How do you reconcile, because I imagine many members of Resource Generation are white, or how does that play out? Because you obviously don't want to say like, okay, well, we're not going to do anything then because we don't want to be that, but at the same time we want to really empower those local communities. How do you reconcile those?
Sure. So I think it's an art, not an exact science, and it's also about both, a combination of things rather than either or. And I really think what it fundamentally comes down to is trust. Comes down to trust. It comes down to relationship building. And I think for people with class privilege, or white people with any sort of privilege that are seeking to help, it's really about listening, first and foremost, about trusting the people that you're supposedly trying to help around them having the best solutions to the problems that they're facing, or them knowing, sort of being able to see, because it's their lived experience, what the intersections of the different oppressions and injustices they're facing, and what solutions might be possible to overturn or remedy those sort of in the most beneficial way. And so I really think that there is a way to be, a person with class privilege, or a white person, as you say. There is a way to help out, communities that are more directly impacted by injustice in a way that is not, perpetuating the dynamics of privilege and oppression. That's not just, parachuting in and saying, I've got the solution to your problem. But if you go in humbly, if you go in without expectations, if you go in just saying, what can I do to help, and take the time to build trust. And I think I emphasize trust again and again, because we can only have authentic relationships when there's trust involved, I think. And so much of how change happens and systems are transformed in a situation where it's about, someone or a group of people wanting to help out another group of people, it's really about taking the time to build those relationships so that they can be authentic, so that when I, as a wealthy person, go into a community that I'm not a part of and say, hey, I want to help you out, how can I help? That we take the time to develop, and I have the patience to develop a level of trust, so that that community I'm coming into will actually tell me authentically what they need from me, right? And that we can have a relationship where, like, I'm probably going to make a mistake, and that's okay. People make mistakes. I do not think fear of making mistakes should be a reason for anyone to not act or not be engaged. But I also think we need to have the space and the relationships and the trust to be able to be told when we're making a mistake, and then be able to, fix it or realize why, and, remedy the harm done, and then learn from that mistake and keep moving.
One of the things we've been particularly interested in here at Lift Economy is this idea of investing that capital for impact, or, using there's sort of a movement around 100% impact for some folks. And one of the traditional challenges, maybe it's even affects some of your members, is this. It's the way traditional foundations or wealth management is. It's where you may have a small percentage of money going towards progressive causes, but the vast majority of someone's wealth might be invested in something like Monsanto or ExxonMobil or in the portfolio. Is this an issue that you discuss at Resource Generation, is how to get those, remove some of the foundational or wealth and put them into impact focused investments?
Absolutely. It's an increasing focus, impact investing in Resource Generation. And I want to give credit to the regenerative finance Group, which is another organization that was born out of some resource generation members really seeing the need and having a desire for more of a focus and development of what an application of resource generation values and regenerative financial values would be to the investing world. So I want to start off by just crediting the folks at Regenerative Finance for a lot of this. And yes, in general, resource generation, along with I think dozens of other organizations and communities that work within or around the wealth management and philanthropic sectors have taken on this idea of impact investing more and more. And I think for me, what that means, and for many of our members, what it means is actually pushing the envelope on what that means in the first place. So I think something like negative screens, which is, making sure that you are not invested in certain things, right? Were popular several decades ago around tobacco, for example. I don't want to be invested in tobacco, or I don't want to be invested in guns. And everything else was fine, but the negative screens would take out the most horrific things. And I think even with some of the most robust negative screens, or even some positive screens around, for example, I only want to be invested in companies that have a certain percentage of women as CEOs or in senior leadership, or I only want to be invested in companies that have some sort of a green certification on them, right? I recently looked or was looking at my own stock portfolio at some point and realized that one of the sort of quote unquote green certifications, Target, had that certification. And then there was something else around the women in leadership one where Walmart made the cuts. And so I thought to myself, Target and Walmart might be having, interesting initiatives around some of these things, like women in leadership, or around, Walmart now has organic or whatever, which I think is beneficial in some ways, but I don't actually believe in the fundamental sort of premise of a corporation like Walmart or a corporation like Target and sort of the bigger ways that they act, and I think sort of exploit local business, exploit people on the planet, exploit labor on many levels. And so I think for me and for resource generation, a lot of what we look at with the investing piece is really asking, again, the hard questions about what do investments look like that are truly socially just, that are truly in alignment with my values, and not just sort of something that like feels good, but isn't actually sort of challenging the bigger systems at play.
Yeah, and it seems like publicly traded companies are themselves very limited in their ability to create impact, and so it's you almost it's one of the challenges I think with impact investing, at least in the publicly traded stock markets, is sometimes the best you can do is Google and Nike and Starbucks,
right.
which is all better than ExxonMobil and Monsanto, but it's not necessarily creating the radical change we would want to see in the world.
Right.
I have my cheesy consulting question for you is, what are the top 2 to 3 things that keep you up at night?
That's a great question. The top 2 to 3 things that keep me up at night are, one of them is around hopelessness. I feel kept up at night that even people who care so deeply about social justice and social change, no matter what background they're from, either myself included, hit up against some really, I think, devastating hopelessness or burnout, or sort of a feeling of insignificance, such that they stop being able to do their best work, and we as sort of a broader movement stop being able to be as effective or as powerful as we can be, because somewhere inside each of us, and therefore somewhere inside us collectively, we don't believe that the change we want is actually possible. And at the end of the day, I do believe that the change we want is possible. I believe we actually have no other choice than to radically change the world, and that especially communities directly impacted by injustice have always historically, done what it takes to make the change that we need to survive and thrive. And so while at the end of the day, I do believe that hope and change will persevere, I do sit up at night worrying about my own and other people's sort of inability to get out of under the thumb of the daily grind of it all, and really like rise to that occasion. I think something conversely that makes me very hopeful against something that helps me sleep at night is thinking about and witnessing some of the most amazing forces of social change and social power that I've seen in my lifetime as a 30-year-old around the movement for Black lives, the current protectors of water at Standing Rock in North Dakota, are people really amazingly showing up and standing up for what they know is right and what they need, and incredible movements of solidarity and intersection between those and other communities really taking action and fighting for their rights are things that that actually do keep me deeply hopeful and inspired and humbled, really humbled, and pushing me to continue to do my best and most visionary work, because I want to be able to, match that.
Yeah, so it's both.
And yeah.
Yeah, it's both keeping you up in a bad way, but also things keep you up in a good way because it's there's positive change coming as well.
Yep. Exactly. Exactly. I think something else that keeps me up at night is actually, I don't know quite how to describe it, so I'll say it in a few different ways, but something about like class stratification, and also stratification of communities. In so many ways we're in the most intersected and globalized world that we've ever been in, and we, can see pictures from halfway across the world instantaneously, and that helps us develop understanding and compassion of other cultures and all of these things. But then I examine some things that are happening in our own country right now, like how the current system has totally screwed over many white working class communities, many rural communities, who now feel as though they have no other choice but to vote for Donald Trump for president, because he's an alternate solution and is making, well, I believe they are false promises, hopeful sounding things about their own futures and ability to survive. And I think there's actually an incredible amount of stratification and lack of understanding in our culture right now in this insidious way, given that sort of what we're told and what we seem to experience is actually that we're more interconnected than ever.
And do you find yourself optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
I am optimistic about the future, and sometimes I feel scared. I wonder, growing pains, are a thing. Teenagers go through them, children go through them, organizations go through them, and societies go through growing pains. And I do feel ultimately optimistic and hopeful, that things will fundamentally change. Things will get better for people on the planet. We will all survive and be able to thrive on the other side. And I think society is and will continue to go through some very, very deep and sometimes harmful growing pains, that are turbulent and are hopeful, are cracking at the surface, are shaking the foundation in really amazing, powerful ways, but also ways that have, that also bad things come of sometimes in the ultimate getting to the final better place.
Here's another question from my from the files here.
Yeah.
What do people never ask you that you wish they did?
That is a great question. Let's see. Well, I don't have a question, but I do have some things that I wish I got to speak more about around our work that often get
Sounds
sidelined.
great. Let's do it.
Cool. So, one thing that I don't feel as though there's enough platform for is talking about, particularly some of the systems that keep wealth accumulated in the first place. So I think there's Resource Generation used to talk a lot more about this, and I think we still do. But around this sort of myth of like the self-made man, right? Many people have heard that myth where like anyone in America can pull themselves up by their bootstraps and sort of make it. And that is now more untrue than ever. I don't know the exact statistics, but I think, if your parents don't have a college education, or you come from a certain level of income or wealth insecurity from as a child, you are like infinitely less likely to be able to have access to financial success as an adult than someone who grew up in a home where both parents went to college or where there was a higher level of financial security. And I really think we need to examine the fundamental sort of opportunity, right, that everyone is afforded, and really examining squarely in particular, I think, the racial bias in that. And I also think there's a gender bias. I also think there's an ability bias, right, for people who are born or have different abilities. But I think the racial oppression and the racial bias isn't quite strong enough a word, the racial prejudice that sort of dictates what opportunities people are even afforded, right? How much more likely it is for a Black boy to end up in jail versus a white man in college, is just absolutely abhorrent and sickening. And talk about what keeps me up at night. That is something. And I think we as a culture need to address that more squarely, and not just lament about it or feel bad about it, but actually make systemic changes so that that's no longer the case. And there was one other thing I was thinking about that I wish people asked me more about. Oh, something else on a more sort of like personal or spiritual note even is, I think one of the reasons why Resource Generation's work is successful and why I was drawn in was because I think that fundamentally most people who have wealth aren't bad people, right? Like babies aren't born terrible human beings who are greedy and, less sympathetic because they have more access to money and kept behind gated communities. I think most every human that's born wants to be in community, wants to be generous, wants everyone around them to have enough. Like there's countless studies that show the more economically stratified a culture or a nation is, the more hatred there is, the more violence there is, the more, like every index shows that the more equitable wealth is distributed, actually like the happier and the safer and the more successful everyone in that society is. And I deeply believe that actually at the end of the day, wealthy people and people who have wealth and class privilege can come to understand that they would benefit, and many people in Resource Generation do, and that's why they're in the organization, like that we will benefit when there is an equitable distribution of land, wealth, and power, even though we're taught and everyone is trying to convince us that it is not within our best interest or not within our financial best interest. And I think it's tricky because a lot of wealthy people and a lot of people with privilege in the media, or more publicly, or who are famous, are doing messed up things with their wealth and are not acting in the interest of everybody and are only acting in their own self-interest. And I think there's really rightful reasons to be super, super, super angry at sort of the 1%, if you will. But the thing that actually I feel hopeful around, and I am trying my best to sort of instigate conversations around in wealthy and class privileged communities, is really around connecting with our own humanity, and how if we really ground in it, I deeply, deeply believe wealthy folks understand that we will be better off with a more equitable distribution of wealth as well, and that we get to act in our best interest towards that, not just in a charity model, right? That it's actually in our best interest when this succeeds too.
That's one of the reasons I was drawn to the B Corp movement, because it presupposes that Wall Street bankers are not inherently evil. It's that they're just playing by the rules of the system that was set up. So if we want different outcomes for society, we have to change the rules of the system and start incentivizing and rewarding good behavior. So I resonate with that. Although I will say my 2-year-old, her favorite word is mine. mine. So maybe, but So let's see some other questions here. Who are some of the folks that you look to? You mentioned Standing Rock, Black Lives Matter as inspiration. Do you want to speak more about either of those or other movements or thought leaders that you look to for inspiration?
Sure. I think one of the beauties of social justice movements is that they are so vast and so multifaceted and take so many different strategies and tactics and faces and forms. So I look to many, 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 many different parts of, broadly speaking, the movement for social justice, for inspiration, for mentorship. I think the movement for Black lives, in the sort of the past several years in particular, and all of the multifaceted ways and hundreds of different organizations and hundreds of thousands of different, people as individuals organizing and working around a very multifaceted platform, for a really interconnected systems overhaul sort of vision of change, that will benefit all of us, again, not just benefit Black communities, but actually benefit everyone, is truly visionary and inspirational. I would also say currently in this moment, the Standing Rock water protectors and the amazing ways that Indigenous folks are just throwing down for the protection of their land and their water, and the connections between movements for climate justice with Indigenous rights with a decolonization lens, I think is really powerful and impressive. I also take inspiration from historical movements. I spent a while sort of in a self-study in 2010 on the history of the civil rights movement and the intricacies within it. And actually what I came with was a lot of inspiration around how like with any movement, when you really peel back the curtain and look at the different leaders and the different factions and the different people, the civil rights movement wasn't perfect. The leaders within it fought about strategies, and some people were too radical and some people were too conservative. And, there were different, various issues along the way. And yet there was something so powerful about that broad-based movement that was so impactful. I really take a lot of inspiration and guidance and sort of solace, frankly, in seeing, okay, like no movement is perfect. No movement has everything figured out, but you keep on working and you keep on trying and you make mistakes and you learn from them and you try again and you continue to figure out ways of partnering that are meaningful and respecting everyone's diversity of tactics and, agitating where you need to. And I take a lot of inspiration from that. Yeah, I think those are a few. I'm just pausing to think if there are other. I think another broad movement to name is like the immigrant rights movement, and particularly like the young people, so bravely, the undocumented young people who are coming out in force and continue to around advocating for total immigration reform in the United States. I guess the bottom line is just I take inspiration from sort of the ways that all of our different movements and issue areas really intersect and overlap, and at their best are really working on behalf of all of each other.
Is there a book or one or two books that do you often give as a gift?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me think about that for a moment. Sadly, in this day and age, like hard handheld books are harder and harder to come by, or things that people even want. But one book that I've given to several people and recommended is a book by Adam Hochschild, and it's a memoir called Half the Way Home. Adam Hochschild is an author who wrote a New York Times bestseller called King Leopold's Ghost. He wrote Bury the Chains. He writes really amazing historical nonfiction documenting often the people who were fighting against the oppressive systems in play. So one of his books talked about the slavery abolition movement in Britain in like the 1700s. But he wrote a memoir about his experience growing up as a wealthy young person. Adam is a few generations older than me, so growing up in the 50s and 60s as a person, a young white man with a lot of wealth and class privilege, growing up in that type of community and environment, and the challenges and heartbreaks of sort of what it's like to grow up in a wealthy place, and also the opportunity and his politicization around really getting involved in movements for justice in meaningful ways. So for people who have a similar experience to that, I love that book and I recommend it all the time.
Phenomenal. What do you need right now? Is there any way that the listeners can support your work at Resource Generation?
Sure. Can I name one other book?
Yes, absolutely.
Because I thought of one. Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, which I believe came out in 2014. Her huge book about the connections between the climate crisis and sort of economic systems it's a beast to get through, but it is incredibly educational. I think I and probably, many other people, make grandiose statements about how, the economy and the state of capitalism right now is totally ravaging the planet, the earth, but I can't really make concrete statements or tell anecdotes that just back that up, super clearly. And Naomi Klein's book is just full of example after example after example after example of the horrific ways that that trade deals and extractive energy processes, people sort of racing to the bottom line in terms of how much money they can make in profit in the sort of utmost exploitation of the planet or their laborers, sort of lower down the labor hierarchy, et cetera. Just such clear connections between those actions, those deals, those policies, and just the simultaneous ravaging of the planet and our sort of ever accelerating nosedive into really like no longer having an earth that's inhabitable. And it's quite a frightening book to read, but it's also it just gave me so much of a fire in my belly of, oh, these are the examples that I am searching for when I say I know somewhere within me that the climate crisis and the ravaging of the planet is deeply connected to some of our, what I think are terrible economic systems. And it just really hits it out of the park with those connections.
I will second that that book is great, and I'll second that it's very long too.
Yeah, it really took me a while to get through, but it was incredibly well worth it.
So yeah, so what about things that our readers, or sorry, listeners
Yeah,
can do for resource generation?
sure. I think what listeners can do for resource generation is spread the word. I think so often when I talk to people about the work that I do at Resource Generation, they say, "Holy shit, holy cow, I've never heard of something like that. I had no idea that would exist. It never occurred to me that that would be a strategy for contributing to social change." And people from across the class spectrum say that. And I think the more we can get the word out about resource generation, in particular to communities that might be unlikely allies. Um, so resource generation was born out of many people who inherited their wealth, so grew up in wealthy communities, were mostly white, had sort of a particular shared experience of sort of like community and feelings, and many were in the same social network. And I think how listeners can be helpful is by really spreading the word of resource generation into the communities of people who are, diehard business owners, but who want to do good with their profit. And how can we wrestle with our disagreements and then come together and unite around our similarities for the kind of world we want? I want to open up those conversations with a broader sect of people, and I also want to recruit more people into resource generation. I mean, I don't want to generate more young people who have wealth to continue the the unjust distribution of wealth in this society, but statistically speaking, there's something like over 750,000 millennials in resource generation's age demographic who also would be part of about the top 5% of households financially and self-identify as progressives. And we have about 450 members right now. So I want to reach the rest of the, whatever that math is, 700 and 400 and 950,000. I can't even say the number, but some incredible, hundreds of thousands more of young people with wealth who are progressive, because I know they're out there, and I want them to, join up with us to really be able to make collective change and impact on the world.
And where can folks learn more about your work and get involved with resource generation?
Sure. So folks can go to our website, which is www.resourcegeneration.org. And there's a button on the website that you click to get involved, and you can fill out a little form. And then one of our national organizers will follow up with you depending on your geography. We'll try and match you with one of our national organizers who works with that region or that city. And they'll get you hooked up with the people doing work closest to where you live.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.